So our next panelist is Dr. April Zeoli. Dr. Zeoli is the Associate Professor at the School of Criminal Justice at the Michigan State University, and she's going to talk about stronger protections for victims of domestic violence.
3.4% of non-fatal intimate partner violence events involve a firearm. 3.4% may not sound like much, but that amounts to roughly 32,900 a year in the United States, or just over 90 per day. Guns are used non-fatally to threaten, to intimidate, to coerce, to pistol whip, and to shoot at victims of intimate partner violence, and sometimes their children or loved ones. We often mostly hear about fatal events that involve guns. And for intimate partner homicide in 2017, about 58% of them were committed with a gun. And that does represent an increasing upward trend of the percentage of intimate partner homicides that involve a gun over the past few years in the United States. And that upward trend in the percentage that involves guns coincides with an upward trend in the number of intimate partner homicides as well. So this is a very concerning trend in the United States. Between 6 and 20% of intimate partner homicides involve at least one additional victim. Those victims are most often children of the targeted intimate partner, other family members, sometimes they're police officers. And the majority of intimate partner homicides that involve more than one victim are committed with guns. You may have heard that 53% of mass shootings in this country involve the killing of an intimate partner or family member victim. Now, there are two ways that specify that domestic violence perpetrators are not allowed to have guns. And those are through domestic violence restraining orders that carry firearm restrictions, and also convictions for misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence. And let's talk about the domestic violence restraining order firearm restrictions first. And I'm going to refer to domestic violence restraining orders as DVROs, so I don't have to say that phrase over and over again. DVRO firearm restrictions are incredibly important because they are initiated by the victim. The victim applies for a DVRO. The victim doesn't have to wait for a police report, for prosecuting attorneys to decide to charge the batterer. They don't need to wait for a conviction. They just have to petition, and very quickly a judge will make a decision about the petition. They also don't have to wait the amount of time it takes for a case to make its way through the criminal justice system, from arrest and charges through to conviction. A DVRO goes into place relatively quickly. So they can be a way for someone who is in crisis, who is in danger right now, to find safety. 4 longitudinal ecological level studies of the impact of state-level DVRO firearm restriction laws have found that they are associated with decreases in intimate partner homicides committed with firearms and with decreases in total intimate partner homicide. And this is important because we're not just changing the method of death. We're not just decreasing intimate partner homicides with firearms. We're seeing associated reductions with the total number of intimate partner homicides, suggesting that these laws save lives. But there are some variations from state to state in these DVRO firearm restrictions. And one of them is whether dating partners can be covered. Under the federal DVRO firearm restriction law, dating partners are not covered. Current and former spouses are covered, those who share a child are covered, and people who live or used to live together are covered. Some states don't have their own state-level DVRO firearm restriction, so they rely on the federal law and don't cover dating partners. Some states have their own DVRO firearm restriction, but still don't cover dating partners. But some have their own law and do cover dating partners, so there's a lot of variation. The next source of variation is whether ex parte or emergency restraining orders are covered. And ex parte orders are those orders that go into place very quickly. Someone petitions for the DVRO, and a judge decides if their case warrants the protection a DVRO would provide right away, before a hearing that the respondent had the opportunity to attend. And some states cover those, but the federal government doesn't, and some states don't. The third variation is whether a state requires a judge or allows a judge to require a person who is now prohibited from possessing a gun under a DVRO to relinquish their guns. So this is an implementation step. If somebody already possesses a gun and now they're prohibited, they possess the gun illegally now and need to get rid of it in order to not have one, to be in the spirit of the law. So I and many of the people in this room, or at least some of the people in this room, did a study last year, and we looked at these three differences in the DVRO firearm restriction laws. And the first one we looked at was coverage of dating partners. And we found that in comparisons to states that didn't have their own DVRO firearm restriction law, so just relied on the federal law, states that covered dating partners under DVRO firearm restrictions had an associated 13% reduction in intimate partner homicide and an associated 16% reduction in intimate partner homicide committed with firearms. And this kind of makes sense because roughly 50% of intimate partner homicides right now are committed by dating partners. We spend a lot more time dating these days than we used to. We get married later, divorce is relatively common, so you spend a lot more time exposed to dating partners, and they can pose a greater risk. The second thing we look at was the coverage of those ex parte orders. And similar to the finding with dating partners, we found that coverage of ex parte orders was associated with a 13% decrease in intimate partner homicide and a 16% decrease in intimate partner homicide committed with guns. And again, the logic here makes sense. If someone is in danger now, if a judge decides, looking at their petition, that they need the protections a domestic violence restraining order will bring now, waiting 10 days, 2 weeks, in some places a month for that full hearing so that a firearm restriction can be put on after the full hearing may leave them exposed to a great amount of risk for a relatively long period of time. So using that period, having firearm restrictions in that period may save lives. 2 studies looked at whether those relinquishment provisions were associated with intimate partner homicide, and they found a 10 to 12% reduction in intimate partner homicide and a 14 to 16% reduction in intimate partner homicide committed with guns. And again, this is about implementation. You can say that someone is restricted from having a firearm, but if they have one and law enforcement does not remove it from them or they do not relinquish it in some way, then you haven't really safeguarded their victims. Next, on to the misdemeanor firearm restrictions. The federal government also has this domestic violence misdemeanor firearm restriction, and 2 studies that have looked at that have found reductions in intimate partner homicide, about 9 to 10% reduction across states in intimate partner homicide. And the studies that have looked at the state-level restrictions in comparison with states that don't have their own law, so that rely on the federal law, have not found an association with intimate partner homicide, again, comparing them with that federal law, which does have an associated reduction. But some states have gone further than that and have said, if you're convicted of a violent misdemeanor crime, it doesn't matter who that victim was. It doesn't matter what your relationship to them was, stranger, wife, dating partner. You are not allowed to have a gun for 5 years, 10 years, for some amount of time. And states that have done this, that have done away with that relationship requirement, have found a 23% reduction in intimate partner homicide. 23% is really big. So why might we see such a large reduction in intimate partner homicide in association with those laws that are not specific to intimate partner violence? Well, one reason we think is because those people who are committing severe and potentially fatal intimate partner violence don't just specialize in intimate partner violence, they're committing other violent crimes as well. So they may be prohibited already from gun ownership under these violent misdemeanor prohibitions. We may be safeguarding victims that way. The other reason is the way the background check works. If someone is convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor crime, they could be convicted under any number of statutes, assault, battery. It may not be specific in the statute that this is domestic violence and has that required relationship needed in states or the federal government to qualify for the domestic violence misdemeanor prohibition. So it could be difficult to identify them in the background check, or at least more difficult to identify them than it is if you're just saying if you've convicted of a violent crime, you can't have a gun. So if assault shows up, it doesn't matter what the relationship is. The person doing the background check doesn't have to check and find out what the relationship is. They're just prohibited from having a gun. So it may be easier to implement the purchase prohibition. Because implementation is important, and Shannon gave us really a wonderful overview of implementation, and I think these aspects are going to be echoed quite a bit today. But we need to implement these restrictions. The possession restriction, we have some counties, some places that are really doing a good job with creative planning on how to legally and safely remove guns from those who now possess them illegally. But we need more jurisdictions to get to work on that. The purchase restriction, it requires those disqualifying records to go into the background check system fairly immediately, and for it to be obvious that these are disqualifying restrictions, so that when a background check is conducted, the person isn't allowed to buy a gun. It also requires a background check to occur. In states where you can buy from a private seller without a background check, the purchase restriction is much harder to enforce because you have that group of people who simply don't have to do one. So my recommendations are that Congress and state legislatures extend domestic violence restraining order firearm restrictions to cover dating partners and to cover those ex parte orders. If we cover this broader group of people, we may be covering more people who are potential intimate partner homicide perpetrators, and even if they're not, people who are potential non-fatal gun use perpetrators. We also need Congress and state legislators to potentially extend firearm restrictions to people convicted of violent misdemeanors and not just domestic violence misdemeanors. Again, the research suggests that this is associated with reductions in intimate partner homicide. And we also have research to suggest that people convicted of violent misdemeanor crimes are likely to commit more violent crimes in the future. So this is a risky group of people that we probably want to remove guns from to safeguard the public. And finally, Congress, state legislatures, implementing organizations, everybody needs to get together on implementation of these restrictions. The relinquishment laws need to be passed in states that don't have them. Jurisdictions need to have written protocols and resources dedicated to implementation, so we do need those resources to go to implementation of the possession restriction. And we also need to work on the purchase restriction. Purchase or licensing laws, which we'll hear more about in just a moment, are found to be an effective way to reduce gun violence, and I'll save that for our next speaker. But we also need to remove private sellers' ability to sell without a background check. And if we do that, we may save more lives. Thank you.